I'm David Clayton, and this is the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture. Hi there, we're here again with Charlie Deist. Great to see you, Charlie.
Likewise.
And before we start, where are you? This is we're doing this via Zoom, but I'm just looking curiously at the background there. Where are you sitting?
Yeah, you might be able to tell from some context clues. I've got the barometer and some line there. I'm down at the boat at the Berkeley Marina. This is becoming my home office slash. Well, of course, it's a sailboat, so its primary function is for sailing, but it doubles as a little recording studio. So, got to get you down here one of these days, and we'll record from the boat.
I'd love to do that.
For as long as we can't go to the garden, the convent.
Yeah, and we were just chatting before, and I was saying that you're like a new version of Radio Caroline, which Brits of a certain age will know. This was pirate radio, sitting offshore in a boat, beaming this revolutionary 1960s pop music. So we can worry about that in a different way. But this is it just reminded me of that with your sort of libertarian interests. So great stuff.
Well, hopefully we'll be noted for our revolutionary ideas.
Yes.
Although even that has a bit of a mixed connotation.
Radical and interesting and harmonizing, which in today's world is revolutionary, but it's in a metaphorical way, if we can call it that. We're not trying to instigate violence or topple a society. We want to uphold it. Okay, so today, again, regular listeners and viewers will know the themes that Charlie and I tend to focus on. Charlie is organizing another 50-mile walk, and we mentioned this a little bit about the last one he did. But I just want to introduce the subject, and how can a 50-mile walk, what can that do? Well, how can that be connected with the way of beauty? And so my view of these things and what Charlie is doing, which I find very interesting, is that that really in life, the harmonizing factor for all of us is Christ. And so all human activity can be ordered to a relationship with Christ, with at its heart, of course, the worship of God and the encounter with Christ in the liturgy. So potentially all human activity can be ordered to it. And so when we look at things that don't seem so obviously liturgical, what we're thinking about is how these mundane activities might be ordered to a liturgical principle and a Christological principle. And so the premise here is that once we start with Christian anthropology and work our way down from or up from that principle, however you view it, work away from that principle to the consideration of all aspects of the human person, then the dichotomies that we're aware of disappear. And so eating is both physical and can have a spiritual symbolism to it. It nourishes the body, but then of course it nourishes the whole person, who is a unified whole, who's physical, material and spiritual. And so it has an impact on our spiritual lives. And there are patterns of eating which indicate this to us through the feasting and the fasting of the year. And the timing of these cycles is daily, weekly, seasonal, and annual. And so what the sort of things that Charlie is looking at is in a sense conforming to these patterns in the things that we eat, the things that we don't eat. Exercise is something else you're very interested in. We'll touch on that in this podcast. Work and recreation. And then, of course, prayer and worship, we know follows these cycles. If you're a Catholic or an Orthodox and you follow the liturgical year, less so in other traditions. But the harmonizing principle is Christ. And so I just thought it was worth saying that, just in case people feel we're getting a little bit tangential here. So first of all, Charlie, tell us about what you're doing, what you're organising, and give us just a summary of why this is, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction of the concept and tying it back to the theme of this podcast and the kind of the unifying principle of our lives, which is the worship of God, and you bring it back to Christ, which I haven't always done, at least explicitly in my mind, but I think that beneath the surface, there's a sense of being called, being summoned, being challenged to go beyond maybe what you thought you were capable of doing. And so JFK, when he was president-elect in 1960, just after winning the election, but before taking office, started to call Americans to a higher kind of being with this essay that he wrote for Sports Illustrated called The Soft American. And this essay could have been written today, and it would still resonate, I think, in the same ways that it did then. Since the 1960s, Americans have undergone kind of ebbs and flows with respect to the popularity of physical fitness, and you can think of the 80s when there was all kinds of movements to do calisthenics and all those little parklets that line the paths where you can do pull-ups or special kinds of push-ups. I think those came around the 80s. So there was this wave where people became more aware of the need to take care of their health. And Kennedy's point was that every civilization of the past, at least any of the ones that we have any record of, the ones that were successful enough to sort of survive the test of time, had a knowledge of physicality and the causes of vitality and vigor, which we're in danger of forgetting because modern life is so comfortable, so convenient in ways that we don't actually have to move or be physical in the ways that our ancestors used to. So the call that was adapted from this essay was the Kennedy Challenge, or the Kennedy March, 50 miles in 16 hours or less. And he picked this up from Teddy Roosevelt, who had issued it as a challenge to his army generals, saying, even though it's peacetime, we need to be prepared in the event of a conflict. And my officers seem to be softened. So Teddy Roosevelt, this great promoter of the strenuous life, called on his officers to do this. He actually gave them 3 days. But Kennedy said, you should be able to do it in a single day, 16 hours. A few people kind of took up the call, including his brother, who is Attorney General, Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy did it with some aides. All of his aides dropped out by mile 35, but Robert Kennedy finished the march. Wow. And this spawned a lot of knockoffs. People started doing it around the world, even though it wasn't required of them. Boy Scout troops. And actually, interestingly, Europe was where it caught on more so than the United States. And throughout the past 50 years, we've had some traditions that have remained. But in general, it's become rare for people to do that long of a distance unless they're doing some kind of an ultra marathon. I've never done a marathon or an ultra marathon, but walking is something that I think is accessible to everybody. Even if you can't do a full 50 miles, most people can walk, 5 or 10 miles. And in my experience, if you can walk 10 miles, you can walk 20. And from there, it's just a matter of working up until you get to the full 50.
If you can do 10, you can do 20, and after that, 50's a breeze. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll see. I don't plan on doing the 50. I hope to join you for part of it, and we'll come to the additional meaning of this. I think it's worth bringing up that, as with nearly everything in modern society, there's a dualism here. We swing from one extreme to the other. So while there's a very strong aspect of what you described, sounds familiar to me, the other end of the spectrum is what you might, and friend of mine described it to me as this just yesterday, the cult of health and wellness, which is absolutely dissociated from what it means to be natural, or to what is natural for mankind, and makes a virtue out of it, without seeing it as a maybe the end is sexual attraction or something, but it's certainly not to make us fit for the life of a Christian. And so we need to guard against that. And then the second point I have is that the language of virtue is something that really, it comes from vir, meaning man, but ultimately, in order to, the connotation there, which is of course true for men and women, is that we require strength, and it needs discipline and strength to lead the good life, not just in a positive sense in what we follow, but also in restraint. And this is where the ideal of the gentleman comes. It's the man who knows how to be restrained, as well as how to actually act well and vigorously. And I think this in turn comes from the medieval ideal of chivalry. So if we put it into that background, I'm not saying we need to do the 50 miles in chainmail, but there is a good place for this. And in fact, your point about the fact that we're walking, that this is something that anyone or most can do. I mean, at some level, some people can't, of course, not everyone is able to do so, but leads, I think, more naturally into the argument that this is something that fits into a bigger picture of Christian anthropology, or it does in my mind. So I don't know if you want to respond to those. First of all, the cult aspect, and then should we say the chivalry aspect of what I said.
I think you can contrast the cult of fitness with a healthy physical culture. And Pope Pius XII actually made a point of this. He was an athletic pope. He actually had a gymnasium installed in the Vatican, but he put some boundaries on what were the proper roles for exercise. You know, St. Paul talks about a little exercise profits the body, but godliness is profitable unto all things. And so exercise, keeping it within the boundaries of proper proportion, means that you're not worshiping the body. You're strengthening and energizing it rather than draining it. You're providing some sort of refreshment for your spirit. You're not working to the point of spiritual sloth. And then lastly, it doesn't disturb sort of the peace and the sanctity of the home. Mm. And I'm borrowing this. I actually just recently learned of Pope Pius XII's teachings from a book that I'm excited to promote, which is Dr. Kevin Vost's Fit for Eternal Life. And he's a psychologist with a background in bodybuilding, who's essentially trying to come up with kind of a theology of bodybuilding, where you become your own personal trainer by practicing virtue, by practicing, like you say, discipline, self-restraint. And part of that is just the knowledge of, what works and what doesn't, prudence, a kind of instrumental rationality. But then it's also that brings all of the other cardinal virtues into play, from fortitude to what else? The idea of bringing your body under your control in the pursuit of helping other people, charity. That's probably the ultimate reason to be stronger, is so that you can be more effective in whatever other ministries or vocation you're pursuing.
Right, that's great. I'll post that up on the notes that go with the show. I think I might also just put up my own painting of the New Evangelist, and I chose a picture of a medieval knight. And I thought about this very carefully. I didn't want to be accused of just having this romantic view of the past, which can happen in some Catholic circles, particularly traditional ones, actually. And there's much that's good of the past, of course, but I thought that this would speak to people today because of the image we have. Chivalry is still associated with medieval knights most, I think, perhaps because the ideal was not promoted so strongly in times since. But I felt that this would, even as a symbol of the past, if you like, would speak to people today for that reason. Okay, so let's come back to the 50-mile march. Tell us a few more details and anything else that seems relevant, but particularly how this fits in with, first of all, what sparked it off on this occasion, what made you decide to do another one so quickly, and we'll just go from there. So tell us why now.
The genesis for the idea came to me when I was out sailing, and you notice when you're in the central part of San Francisco Bay that there are 3 bridges. There's one to the north, the Richmond San Rafael. Directly to the west is the Golden Gate leading out to the Pacific. And then there's the Bay Bridge that goes down to the South Bay. And I've always had kind of a romance around these bridges, and I've crossed them many times. I grew up in Marin County, which is north of San Francisco, and I've lived most of my life in the East Bay. So I'm always crossing these bridges in a car. And until recently, the only one that you could walk was the Golden Gate. But they recently opened up a pedestrian pathway on the Bay Bridge, and then even more recently than that on the Richmond San Rafael. So people can walk or bike. And on the Richmond San Rafael, it's kind of a pilot program to see if people actually use it. I realized that the loop that these 3 bridges make is almost exactly 50 miles. And right around the same time, I had read an article. There's a website called The Art of Manliness, which deals with a lot of these same themes. Sort of what would a modern chivalry look like, and what, who can be, how do you become a gentleman, is the theme of that website and podcast. So I got to planning my own, and I attempted it first on my own and made it from Treasure Island around the 3 bridges. Well, I made it to the Golden Gate Bridge about 11 hours later, 40 miles, and found that the bridge was closed due to a recent policy where they shut it down past a certain time, depending on the time of year, as a suicide precaution, anti-suicide measure. And so I kind of pleaded with the guard on the intercom to let me through and make an exception, but he wasn't having any of it. And so I took a lift to the other side of the Golden Gate Bridge, where I had a ride waiting for me, and knew that I had to try again. And so I planned a bigger group event where I invited people to do their own training beforehand, and I produced a little guide to efficient marching technique, which is relatively straightforward. You put one foot in front of the other, you keep your feet straight, you don't bend them outward, things like that. But there are some nuances, and you can learn it just by practicing and becoming more aware of certain principles, and wearing the right footwear, a minimal foot that conforms to minimal shoe that conforms to the shape of your foot rather than contorting it. Interestingly, Robert Kennedy did his 50-mile march in a pair of pointy Oxford shoes, so extremely uncomfortable. But I have the benefit of using shoes that actually fit my toes, and they're wide in the front, and then there's 0 drop from the heel to the toe. So you're not striking your heel prematurely when you come down. You can swing your leg out farther, and these are all techniques that just make it a little bit easier. And I only got a couple of takers for the second 50-mile march, partly because this was right at the beginning of the shelter in place, and so people were being advised not to meet in groups. Yeah. And so I did it with just my friend Ben, who you do the evening vespers with, and wow. And your housemate. All of our exactly.
So yeah,
we're a small community of the St. Jerome's alum and and current residents. So
yeah.
So this one was a success. We made it around all 3 bridges, did it in about 16 hours, starting at 6 a.m, ending around 9:30 at night. And I had originally planned to do it with another MoveNat trainer, that's natural movement. And this guy, Nathan Amato, was planning on traveling up, but couldn't make it up because of the uncertainty around what was going to be allowed. now that 2 months have passed, I think that it's becoming more and more obvious that we can't go on indefinitely like this, and that we need a little bit of a shot in the arm in the same way that JFK gave this rousing call to all Americans to not become the soft American. That's what we're doing this time around. We're saying going outside and walking is one of the healthiest things you can do. We can talk about the reasons for that, but in a nutshell, staying indoors comes with risks of its own. And so going out in small groups, keeping a distance of a few feet and, not spitting or sneezing on each other seems to me like a reasonable balance of precaution with the need to start to get back outside and live life again.
Great. And this is rather like the whole idea that this 50-mile march, we're not saying unless you do that, you're not matching up to the ideal. What we're saying, this really is a symbol of what everyone can aspire to by degrees, I would say. And so that's true of this. It's a great idea, I think, a symbol of this idea of chivalry and virtue and strength, uniting all these values. And on this occasion, there is a little bit of a rebellious, we're back to Radio Caroline again, bucking the trend, I guess. But I think that this point needs to be made that it's a bit like the cult of health and wellness. If you focus too much on one aspect of any aspect of life and compartmentalize it without thinking of how it connects with others, inevitably you end up having detrimental effects on the others and not being aware of them. And so then you might swing to deal with that and so you end up with these huge sort of swings of focus without having a balance in your life. And something that strikes me is that I just feel that we could do more of an understanding of that what's happening in the lockdown. It's certainly, I'm not against the idea at all. In principle, the clear benefits, and I want people to be healthy and not catch the illness. But there seems to be a lack of recognition in the debate, at least, that there are other aspects to man other than catching a virus. There are all sorts of things that contribute to our health and wellness and general well-being. I think I prefer that word to wellness, that phrase. And that I have a sense that at the moment it's too narrowly focused on avoiding the virus and not enough on the costs of what the proposed measures might have. I don't know. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just cite the quote from Frederick Bastiat, the great classical liberal, who talked about the seen versus the unseen, mostly as it relates to economics. But you have policies that are enacted to help one group where it's highly visible how it helps, but if you don't trace the long-term effects and the unseen unintended consequences, you're missing the big picture. And with coronavirus, we see the hospital deaths from people who we know have the virus, and that's something that we can count, and it's broadcast on every TV screen around the country, and it's something that can be scary, and it is a real cost. But we don't see, at least not immediately, the effects of the bankruptcy, the depression, the domestic abuse, all these things that have gone hand in hand with people being shuttered in for this long. And the one that I would actually like to point out the most, because it relates to both the unseen and actually the seen costs of infection, are the effects of staying indoors on vitamin D production, where we require sunlight to synthesize vitamin D, which is crucial for fighting infection. And there have been some studies. There was one done in the Philippines and another in New Orleans that show some pretty shocking results with regard to who's getting the virus and then who's experiencing the most severe symptoms. And it turns out that something like 80 to, at the lower end of the research, to up to 98% of the mortalities are in people who have vitamin D deficiency. Wow. While only something like 4% of the fatalities are from people who have sufficient vitamin D. So these are just a couple of studies that I can also send you links for. And I recently thought, someone needs to compile this stuff into a document in one place, not just vitamin D, but sunlight produces it's antimicrobial peptides. It upregulates these small proteins that fight bacteria at the level of our skin and kind of the surface contact. So if we're not getting sunlight, we're more susceptible to the virus, and who knows how many additional people have already gotten or will get the virus when they return to the outside world, exposing themselves to other people before they've gotten that dose of sunlight. So in a way, the march, whether you do 5 miles, 10 miles, or 50, is a way to bolster your immune system as we start to reopen so that you don't get the shock to the system.
And we're intending to keep social distance in this. We're not, we hope that if the news channels come and film us, I'm not expecting that, but then it won't go viral because it looks like we're an angry demonstration breaking the rules. I mean, we want to conform as much as
right. Now, one point that I think could be a question in people's minds is masks. And I'm of a few minds about masks because I can see how for certain kinds of interactions, if we're standing here face to face, we all have a tendency to occasionally, even if we don't notice it or can't feel it, there are droplets coming out of our mouth when we talk, especially if we get really excited. So that can be a risk. I think that if you're all walking in one direction, and this also comes from reading actual research into the relative risks of being out on trails where people are walking and biking, and it turns out that it's extremely hard to get infected that way, partly just because you need a certain threshold of the viral load to get infected. So if you're only being exposed to a tiny, infinitesimally small droplet from someone walking on the other side of the path, that's unlikely to take hold. Whereas if you're in the household with someone frequently, conversing or coming into touching contact, that's where it spreads. It's not on the trails. So I don't plan on requiring people to wear masks. I don't plan on wearing one myself. And I think that, this could be taken as a sort of rebellious thing. But to me, it's more of I'm weighing the risk of, getting less oxygen through the mask. Mm-hmm. And another data point in favor of going outside is this open air factor, where during the Spanish flu, soldiers who were treated in the overflow spaces when the hospitals filled up for the Spanish flu, put on cots outside, tended to recover faster than those who were in the tents or in the buildings. And they think that it might have something to do with the presence of ozone in the air, but there are studies on the virucidal effects of open air as well. So again, I think that there are trade-offs that we can kind of debate at the margin what the data says, but in some cases it's fairly clear that going outside, getting fresh air, these are beneficial.
Yes, I go hiking regularly, and when I was under the impression that if you're exercising, you don't have to wear a bag. No one knows precisely what these rules are, I have to say.
They change all the time.
Yeah. So if I'm exercising, and I try and keep my distance, as you say, I'm not looking to cough over people, but I always assume that that's okay. There's another aspect to this which I don't hear discussed, mainly because I don't know that you can quantify it at all or measure it, but it will be there. And that is that if you're forcing people to stay away from work when they're able and willing to do so, there's a dignity in going to work. I mean, this is well recognized. So there's a spiritual benefit to working and earning a living that that contributes to the well-being of the person. Now, again, this can be, it tends to be by some, but this concern for being able to get to work and earn a living tends to be portrayed as not really being interested in the health of the person. It's just about economics and this sort of thing. And I think that betrays the attitudes of the critics. If that's all they say, maybe it's fair in some instances as a criticism, but really people need to go to work. It's part of a human need. It's part of that we have roles to play in society. And if you deny the person that dignity for too long, it will have an impact on them spiritually. And it will then have a knock-on effect because of the unity of the human person in all aspects of their life, including health, I suggest. And so, again, where does that balance lie? It's very difficult if you're running a state or something to know how to balance all these factors. I would say you can imagine nearly everybody in charge is going to make a mistake somewhere. The nature of the political debate doesn't really allow us to examine that constructively, unfortunately. But what I would say is, if people aren't thinking about the need for work, and it's really preferential, it's not just about getting the money so you can live. There's a dignity to doing this, which just does not seem to be taken into consideration in the debate at the moment. And I would like to say that your 50-mile march, in a way, is signifying this as well, that because there's effort involved, there's work. Literally, we're doing work to walk in a natural way, but earning a living is a natural thing for us to do, and contributes. Again, it has to be done in harmony with our end, which is to be in union with God in heaven, but it certainly has its place.
Indeed, I would say I have a formula: nature plus purpose equals immunity, and that might seem kind of like an odd equation, but I'll try to justify it.
Yeah, do.
When I was in college, I had an extended period of illness that was never quite diagnosed. Initially, I thought that it was mono, but there were several tests that came back inconclusive or negative. And now looking back, I wonder if it might have been the H1N1, the swine flu, because it was shortly after the big outbreak. And I had been to Turkey, where they had a particularly bad epidemic of swine flu. So I was on my back for at least a week, just feeling totally awful. And then there were another couple weeks after that when I was feeling still sort of sick as a dog. And somewhere in that period, I think that I lost my motivation. I lost my sense of purpose. I lost all enthusiasm for the things that I was working on. And I needed to rediscover a sense of purpose before I could get better. And it took me months to recalibrate everything in my life to be able to find the motivation to start to move again in ways that inspired me. So I couldn't go to the gym anymore. I couldn't do these sort of long distance runs that I used to do when I was young and free in high school. And looking back in hindsight, I've kind of cobbled together this framework for thinking about not just autoimmunity, but getting stronger in general, and how it's the interplay of natural stressors, things like, gravity. We encounter gravity and having to lift objects, including ourselves. That's at the basis of strength. Temperature is another stressor that leads us to get stronger, whether it's hot temperature or cold temperature. So these natural stressors, plus the general challenge of finding our purpose in life, is kind of an animating contest, and it, in my experience, is the key to feeling well. Where when we don't have a purpose, it's easy to almost distract ourselves with whatever pains, psychosomatic or real, come our way. And at any given moment, most of us are dealing with some sort of pain. Yesterday, I stubbed my toe really bad on one of the cleats here at the dock. And if I were, if I didn't have anything else to think about, I'd probably be thinking about that pain. But the fact that that I've got, interesting conversations to have and interesting work ahead of me, it just kind of fades into the background.
And yes, I've been thinking about what you're saying in another context, actually, that someone was telling me that she had a difficulty in the sort of obsessive thinking. That was distracting. It was making her unhappy. She was obsessed on a particular problem, and it occurred to me afterwards that the problem is not obsession. We're made to be obsessed. We're made to seek God and seek happiness and seek Him. And in a sense, that drives everything we do, or we can't escape from it. If you lose that obsession, which seems to have happened in a way to you, that is not good. We lose a sense of purpose in life. But the goal is to direct that desire for happiness and for life in the right direction. So it seems to me it's not just purpose. I agree with everything you say, but ideally the right purpose. And I think that is what Christianity uniquely supplies. Without it, that you will have fracture. Something is going to be off. Other things may be good, and a purpose is better than no purpose. But really, we all have that drive to be happy. And if we lose that, we really are in trouble. I mean, it seems to me that's what you were sinking towards, was the losing the drive altogether in that situation. So, yeah.
And there is a parallel here. It's not a perfect analogy, but the recovery of the strength that our ancestors had is in some ways parallel to the quest of, the spiritual journey to recover what's been lost through the fall. And, we will not obtain the, immortal bodies through weightlifting and open air exercise, but it is sort of a metaphor that can help us along the way.
Yes. Okay. Well, give us a few details. I think that closes the discussion off nicely. But before we say goodbye, give us a few details about those who are local, how they can team up with you, and when it is and where, and those sort of details. And then also more generally about your your natural movement, and the broader picture that you're promoting. I get your email, so just tell us about that again.
So the website and the newsletter are called A Natural Method. It's anaturalmethod.com. And there's a special page within that. If you just say /March, then you'll get to the page where you can sign up for the guide to efficient marching and the checklist for what it takes to organize your own march. It's the mundane stuff like what kinds of shoes and socks are best, to how to reach out and then plan a march of whatever length you choose. Don't get locked into thinking it has to be a 50-mile march. So the general idea, again, it's inspired by JFK, but the deeper inspiration goes back to the ideas of physical culture. And the more I learned, I'm excited to be exploring this path of Catholic physical culture as laid out by Pope Pius XII. But there's related principles in the writings of an early 20th century naval officer and pioneer of physical education named George Hebert. And he did some really incredible work on what actually does it take to become strong in order to be useful. So he tied it to a framework of morality and virtue, but also getting technical about the best way to do things. And he found that rather than doing isolated exercises in a gym, he got much better results with the recruits for the Navy by exposing them to simulated but real-world challenges. So things like running, jumping, climbing, swimming, fighting, crawling, the full range of human movements, and this is called the natural method, or la méthode naturelle. And I'm not claiming that my method is the natural method, but it is a natural method, and you might find some inspiration for it. So I write about everything from, fasting and nutrition to ways to increase your strength using a home gym or body weight exercises. And I've got an upcoming series on eyesight and how the computer screen combined with corrective lenses is a recipe for deteriorating eyesight, but some ways that we can start to get it back. You might notice I took off my glasses in the course of this interview because I can see you well enough at 18 inches, and I don't need those glasses.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, my eyesight, the moment I gave in and started wearing glasses, remember I'm a lot older than you, I noticed that my eyesight just got progressively worse and worse. I mean, it really...
Same here.
Yeah. Anyway.
So local people can also link up with our march. Just shoot me an email and sign up for the newsletter.
Okay.
We will be starting early on Treasure Island, 5 a.m., and making our way around, making the most of the daylight that we get here in the early summertime.
Okay, terrific. Charlie, thanks very much. And I hope our next conversation, I'd love to know more about Pius XII, actually, when you're ready to tell us about that. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, I'm going to be doing a podcast with Kevin Vost in a couple weeks, actually less than that. And we'll go into more detail. And the new podcast project is an offshoot of A Natural Method, and I'm calling it the Culture Club, looking at how different cultures attract different kinds of customers for people in the physical fitness world. So if you're a trainer or a gym owner or just someone who's enthusiastic about becoming your own personal trainer, these interviews are a way to help you think about what are your values, why are you doing what you do, and using that to motivate and inform the way that you stay healthy.
Okay, terrific. Till next time, Charlie, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, David.
You've been listening to the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture. If you enjoyed this episode, then please give us a 5-star review on iTunes. This will help others to find it too. Also, if you're interested in delving more deeply into the material that we discuss, you can do a course at the Pontifex University website. That's pontifex.university.